David Thompson was bone-tired as he climbed into his beat-up pickup truck that August evening in 1993. His back ached from 10 hours of laying concrete foundations, and his work clothes were still damp with sweat despite the cool air that had rolled in with the storm clouds. At 28, David had been working construction for almost a decade, and days like this reminded him why his body felt older than his years. The rain had been coming down hard all afternoon, turning the job site into a muddy mess, most of. The crew had called it quits around 3 o'clock when the foreman decided it was too dangerous to continue pouring concrete in the downpour. David had stayed behind to help secure the equipment and cover the fresh foundation work with tarps. He was always the last to leave, partly because he needed the overtime pay, and partly because that's just who he was as he drove through the winding back roads toward his small apartment on the other side of town. David noticed how quickly the water was rising along the roadside ditches. The radio crackled with weather warnings, but the static was so bad he could barely make out the words. He'd lived in Mississippi his whole life and had seen plenty of heavy rains, but something about tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged with electricity, and the wind was picking up in a way that made the trees bend and sway like they were dancing to some frantic rhythm. David was about halfway home when he saw the first signs of real trouble. Water was flowing across Highway 61 like a river, and what had been a normal road just hours earlier was now turning into something that looked more like a lake. He slowed down, his truck's headlights cutting through the rain and darkness, trying to figure out if he could make it through or if he should turn around and find another route. That's when he saw them dotted first. David thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Through the rain and the darkness, he could barely make out what looked like a car that had been swept off the road and was now sitting at an angle in the rushing water. But then he saw movement, and his heart nearly stopped. There were two small figures clinging to the roof of the car, and the water was rising fast. David pulled his truck over as close as he could get and jumped out into the storm. The rain hit him like needles, and the wind was so strong it nearly knocked him over. He had to squint to see through the downpour, but there was no mistaking what he was looking at now. Two little kids, maybe 6 or 7 years old, were holding on to each other on top of a car that was being pushed around by the floodwater like it was a toy. The children were screaming, but David could barely hear them over the roar of the water and the howling wind. One of them, a little girl with long black hair that was plastered to her face, was trying to keep her grip on what looked like her brother while also holding on to the car's roof rack. The boy seemed smaller, maybe younger, and David could see that he was crying and shaking with fear and cold. David didn't even think about the danger. He just knew that those kids were going to die if someone didn't help them right now. The car was already starting to shift and move with the current, and it was only a matter of time before it would be swept away completely, taking the children with it. He kicked off his heavy work boots because he knew they would just drag him down in the water. Then he waded in and immediately felt the shocking cold and the incredible force of the current. The water was already up to his waist, and it was moving so fast that he had to fight just to stay on his feet. Every step was a battle, and he could feel rocks and debris hitting his legs as the flood carried everything downstream. The distance between the road and the car couldn't have been more than 30 feet, but it felt like miles. David had to stop twice and grab onto submerged fence posts to keep from being swept away himself. His muscles were already burning from the effort, and he was only halfway there. But every time he looked up and saw those two terrified faces staring back at him, he found the strength to keep going. When David finally reached the car, he could see that the children were in even worse shape than he had thought. They were both shivering uncontrollably, and their lips were turning blue from the cold water. The little girl was trying to be brave, but David could see the fear in her eyes. The boy was barely holding on, his small hands slipping on the wet. metal of the car roof. David had to shout over the noise of the storm to make them hear him. He told them his name and that he was going to get them out of there, that everything was going to be okay. He wasn't sure if they understood him, but the little girl nodded and tried to smile through her tears. The hardest part was figuring out how to get them both to safety. David knew he couldn't carry them both at the same time, not in this current. The water was getting deeper and faster by the minute, and the car was starting to rock back and forth in a way that made his stomach drop. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. He decided to take the little boy first because he seemed to be in the worst shape. David carefully lifted him off the car roof, and the child immediately wrapped his arms around David's neck, so tightly that it was hard to breathe. The boy was lighter than David had expected, but trying to carry him through the rushing water while fighting the current was like trying to walk through a hurricane. Step by step, David made his way back toward the road, talking to the boy the whole time, telling him stories about his own childhood, anything to keep the kid calm and distracted. When they finally reached higher ground, David quickly wrapped the boy in his work jacket and told him to stay put no matter what happened. Then he turned around and went back for the girl. By the time David reached the car again, it had moved at least 10 feet downstream, and the water was even higher. The little girl was still holding on, but David could see that she was getting weaker. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely keep her grip, and her face was pale with exhaustion and fear. This time, when David lifted her off the car, she was surprisingly calm. She looked him right in the eyes and said something that he would never forget for the rest of his life. In a small, clear voice that somehow cut through all the noise of the storm, she said, "Thank you for coming back for me. The trip back too." Shore with the girl felt even longer and more dangerous than the first rescue. The current had gotten stronger, and David was exhausted from his first trip. But somehow, knowing that both children would be safe gave him a strength he didn't know he had. When he finally reached dry ground with the girl in his arms, David collapsed to his knees, breathing hard and shaking from adrenaline and cold. But the night wasn't over yet. The children were safe, but they were also alone, scared, and had no idea what had happened to their family. David stayed with them through the long, dark hours that followed, sharing his thermos of coffee and the emergency blanket he kept in his truck. He told them jokes and stories, anything to keep their minds off the tragedy that was unfolding around them. When the rescue crews finally arrived at dawn, David was still there, keeping watch over 2 children who had become more than strangers in a single night. The first thing David noticed when he woke up in the hospital waiting room was how quiet everything had become. After hours of sirens, shouting rescue workers, and the constant sound of helicopters overhead, the silence felt almost unnatural. His neck was stiff from sleeping in the uncomfortable plastic chair, and his clothes still smelled like floodwater, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Lily and Ryan were alive. The children had been rushed to Greenwood Regional Medical Center along with dozens of other flood victims. David had refused to leave, even when the nurses told him he should go home and get some rest. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside him wouldn't let him walk away from those 2 kids. Maybe it was because he'd seen the terror in their eyes during the rescue, or maybe it was because he knew they had no one else right now. Either way, David wasn't going anywhere. Dr. Patterson, a kind woman in her 50s with gray hair and tired eyes, found David in the waiting room that morning. She sat down beside him and spoke in the gentle voice that doctors use when they have difficult news to share. The children were physically okay, she explained. They had some cuts and bruises, and they were suffering from mild hypothermia, but they would recover completely. The real problem was what they had learned during the night. The flood had been devastating. 23 people had lost their lives, and among them were the children's parents and their grandmother. The family had been visiting from California, and their rental car had been caught in the flash flood while they were trying to evacuate. The parents had managed to get the children onto the roof of the car before the current swept them away. Their bodies had been found downstream early that morning. David felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He'd known it was bad when he saw that car in the water, but somehow he had hoped that maybe the parents had made it to safety, that they were looking for their children right now. The thought of telling Lily and Ryan that their mom and dad weren't coming back made him feel sick. When David finally saw the children again, they were sitting together on a hospital bed, sharing a cup of hot chocolate and wearing oversized hospital gowns. Lily had her arm around her little brother, and they both looked so small and lost that David's heart nearly broke. They didn't ask about their parents right away. Maybe they already knew, or maybe they were too scared to ask the question they didn't want answered. A social worker named Mrs. Henderson arrived that afternoon. She was a professional woman in her 40s who had clearly dealt with situations like this many times before, but David could see the sadness in her eyes too. She sat down with the children and, in the most gentle way possible, explained what had happened to their family. Ryan, who was only 6 years old, didn't seem to fully understand what death meant. He kept asking when his mommy was coming to pick them up, and when Mrs. Henderson tried to explain that wouldn't happen, he would just stare at her with confused eyes. Lily, at 7, understood better. She didn't cry, but she held her brother tighter and asked David if he was going to leave them too. David promised the children that he would stay as long as they needed him, and he meant it. Over the next 3 days, while Mrs. Henderson worked to track down any living relatives, David became their constant companion. He brought them books from the hospital gift shop, taught Ryan how to fold paper airplanes, and listened to Lily tell stories about her family and their life in California. The children talked about their parents in the present tense, as if they might walk through the door at any moment. Lily described how her mother had taught her to make origami animals, and how her father would read them bedtime stories in both English and Chinese. Ryan showed David a small toy car that had somehow survived the flood, clutched in his hand when David pulled him from the water. It was a gift from his dad, and he wouldn't let anyone take it away from him. Mrs. Henderson worked around the clock to find family members who could take the children. The parents had been only children themselves, and both sets of grandparents had passed away years earlier. For a while, it looked like the children might end up in foster care, separated because it was rare to find families willing to take 2 children at once. David found himself thinking about things he'd never considered before. He was single, working a demanding job, and living paycheck to paycheck in a 1-bedroom apartment. He had no experience raising children, and certainly no experience dealing with traumatized kids who had lost everything. But every time he looked at Lily and Ryan, he wondered if maybe there was a way he could keep them together, keep them safe. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Henderson got the call that changed everything. She had finally tracked down a great-aunt in Portland, Oregon, who was willing to take both children. The woman, whose name was Grace Chun, was the sister of the children's grandmother. She was in her 60s, unmarried, and had been a teacher for most of her life before retiring. She sounded kind and patient on the phone, and most importantly, she wanted to give Lily and Ryan a home together, but the news that should have been a relief felt like another tragedy to David. He had grown attached to these children in a way he hadn't expected. They had become his responsibility, his purpose, during the most difficult 3 days of their young lives. The thought of saying goodbye to them felt impossible. The children were confused about leaving. They had never heard of Great Aunt Grace, and Portland might as well have been on the moon as far as they were concerned. Ryan asked David if he could come with them, and when David gently explained that wasn't possible, the little boy started crying for the first time since the rescue. Lily, always the protective older sister, seemed to understand that this was what had to happen. But on their last evening together, she spent an hour carefully folding a piece of paper from a coloring book into a small crane. She had learned to make them from her mother, she explained, and her mother had told her that cranes were symbols of hope and healing. When she finished, Lily pressed the small paper bird into David's hand. Her small fingers closed his around it, and she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for a 7-year-old face. "My mom said that if you make 1,000 cranes, your wish will come true," she whispered. "I'm going to make them every day until we see you again." The goodbye at the airport was the hardest thing David had ever experienced. Ryan clung to his leg and refused to let go, and Lily stood quietly beside them, trying to be brave for her little brother. David knelt down to their level and promised them that they were going to have a good life with their great-aunt, that she would take care of them and love them. He told them to be good, to take care of each other, and to never forget that they were survivors. As David watched their plane disappear into the cloudy sky, he realized that 3 strangers had changed his life forever. The small origami crane in his pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, a reminder of the most important thing he had ever done and the most difficult goodbye he had ever said. David Thompson went back to work the Monday after the children left, but nothing felt the same. He'd walk onto the construction site and find himself thinking about whether Lily and Ryan had eaten breakfast that morning, or if Ryan was still carrying that little toy car everywhere he went. His coworkers noticed he was quieter than usual, more thoughtful. When they asked him about the rescue, David would just shrug and say he did what anyone would have done. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The small origami crane Lily had given him became a permanent fixture on his dresser. Every morning when David got ready for work, he'd see it sitting there in the early sunlight, a tiny reminder of the most important 3 days of his life. He'd never been particularly religious, but sometimes he found himself saying a little prayer that those kids were doing okay, that they were happy and safe in their new home. About 6 months after the flood, David made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He walked into the Greenwood Fire Department on a Tuesday evening and asked about becoming a volunteer. The fire chief, a gruff man named Captain Rodriguez, looked at this construction worker who'd never shown any interest in emergency services and asked him why he wanted to join. David told him about the flood, about pulling those 2 children from the water, and how he realized that night that sometimes being in the right place at the right time could mean the difference between life and death for someone. He wanted to be prepared for the next time, he said. He wanted to know how to do it right. The training was harder than David had expected. 3 nights a week, he'd finish his construction job and then head to the fire station to learn about water rescue techniques, CPR, first aid, and emergency response procedures. His body was already tired from long days of physical labor, but somehow he found the energy to push through. When the other volunteers complained about the cold water training exercises, David would think about that August night and how terrifying it must have been for those children. It took David 2 years to become certified in water rescue, but once he did, he threw himself into the work with a dedication that impressed even the veterans. Every weekend, he'd volunteer for training exercises. When there were real emergencies, David was always one of the first to respond. He saved 3 more people from floodwaters over the next 5 years, and each time he thought about Lily and Ryan and wondered if this was how they felt when someone came to help them. David's personal life began to change too. He met Carol at a volunteer appreciation dinner in 1996. She was a nurse at the same hospital where Lily and Ryan had been treated, and when David told her about the rescue, she remembered those 2 little children and how they had stayed close together through everything. Carol had been the one to help them get ready to leave for Portland, and she told David how they had asked about him every day until they left. David and Carol got married 2 years later. and by 2001 they had 3 children of their own. Tommy was born first, then the twins Jessica and Kevin came along 3 years later. David was a devoted father, but Carol noticed that he had a special tenderness with children who were scared or hurt. When one of their kids had a nightmare, David would sit with them for hours, telling them stories and making sure they felt safe. Before he'd leave their room, the fire department became like a second family to David. He worked his way up from volunteer to assistant chief, and younger firefighters would come to him for advice about water rescues. David never told them that his expertise came from one terrifying night when he had no training at all, just determination and the knowledge that 2 lives depended on him not giving up. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Portland, Lily and Ryan Chun were building new lives with their great-aunt Grace. The older woman had never raised children, but she approached the task with the same patience and dedication she had brought to her 30 years of teaching elementary school. She understood that these children had experienced trauma that would affect them for years to come, and she was determined to give them stability and love. Grace enrolled the children in a good school district and made sure they had counseling to help them process their grief. But she also made sure they never forgot their parents or the man who had saved their lives. She kept photos of their family around the house, and she encouraged the children to talk about their memories whenever they wanted to. Lily threw herself into her studies with an intensity that sometimes worried Grace. She was a straight-A student who spent hours on homework and always volunteered to help other children who were struggling. When she was 10 years old, Lily announced that she wanted to become a nurse so she could help people the way the hospital staff had helped them after the flood. Ryan was quieter and more sensitive than his sister. He still carried that little toy car everywhere, even when he got too old for toys. He loved science and math, and he was fascinated by weather patterns and natural disasters. When he was 12, he did a school project about flood safety that impressed his teachers so much they entered it. In the state science fair, both children were driven by something Grace couldn't quite understand until Lily explained it to her. One evening when she was 15, they felt like they owed something to the world, Lily said. Someone had risked their life to save them, and that meant they had a responsibility to make their lives count for something. Grace helped the children search for David Thompson over the years, but it was harder than they had expected. They knew his name and that he lived somewhere in Mississippi, but there were dozens of David Thompsons in the state. They wrote letters to fire departments and newspapers, but never got responses that led anywhere. This was before the internet made finding people simple, and phone books only went so far. When Lily graduated from high school in 2004, she was valedictorian and had been accepted to nursing school at Oregon Health and Science University. In her graduation speech, she talked about second chances and the responsibility that comes with being saved. She didn't mention David by name, but Grace knew exactly who she was talking about. Ryan followed a similar path, graduating 2 years later, with plans to study emergency medicine. He told Grace that he wanted to be the kind of person who ran toward danger instead of away from it, the way someone had done for him and his sister that terrible night. Both children made origami cranes throughout their teenage years, just as Lily had promised David she would. Grace found them tucked into books, sitting on windowsills, and hidden in dresser drawers. When she asked Lily about them, the young woman explained that her mother had taught her that cranes represented hope and healing. She was making them. Until she could find David Thompson again, no matter how long it took Dot, by the time Lily finished nursing school and Ryan completed his pre-med studies, they had saved enough money to hire a private investigator to help with their search. But even the investigator struggled to narrow down which David Thompson in Mississippi was the right one. The trail had grown cold after so many years, and they were beginning to wonder if they would ever find the man who had given them their second chance at life. Neither the children nor David knew that their paths would cross again, but the foundation for that reunion was being built every day through the choices they made and the lives they lived, all because of one night when a construction worker decided that two strangers were worth risking everything to save. Dr. Ryan Chun was finishing his overnight shift in the emergency room at Seattle General Hospital when the call came in that would change everything. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2023, exactly 30 years after the flood that had shaped his entire life. A paramedic team was bringing in a family whose car had skidded off a rain-slicked highway into a drainage ditch. Two children, a brother and sister, were trapped in the back seat as water began rising around their vehicle. As Ryan rushed to prepare the trauma bay, something about the situation hit him like a physical blow. The children were roughly the same age he and Lily had been that terrible night in 1993. The little girl was holding her younger brother's hand, trying to comfort him despite her own fear. Ryan had to step outside for a moment to collect himself, his hands shaking as memories flooded back. Later that morning, after the family had been treated and released with minor injuries, Ryan found himself staring at his computer screen in the hospital break room. He'd been thinking about David Thompson more and more lately, especially on difficult days when he saw families going through trauma. At 37 years old, Ryan was now an experienced emergency physician, but he still felt like that scared 6-year-old boy sometimes, wondering what had happened to the man who saved his life. Ryan pulled out his phone and called his sister Lily, who was just getting ready for her shift as a charge nurse at Portland Children's Hospital. They talked almost every day, but this call was different. Ryan told her about the family from the car accident and how it had brought back all those memories of their rescue. Lily listened quietly, and when Ryan finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "I've been thinking about David a lot lately, too. Yesterday, I was helping with a little boy who'd been in a house fire, and he reminded me so much of you that night. I keep wondering if David ever thinks about us, if he wonders how we turned out." They had talked about their rescuer countless times over the years, but something about this conversation felt more urgent. Maybe it was because they were both now working in fields where they saved lives every day, or maybe it was because they realized how much time had already passed. Their great-aunt Grace had turned 80 the previous year, and she often talked about how proud their parents would have been of the people they'd become. But there was one person who deserved to know how they'd turned out, and they were running out of time to find him. Lily had always been the more determined of the two when it came to their search. Over the years, she'd written letters to newspapers in Mississippi, called fire departments, and even hired a private investigator back in 2010. But every lead had turned into a dead end. There were too many David Thompsons in Mississippi, and after 30 years, they weren't even sure he still lived in the same area. But technology had changed dramatically since their last serious search attempt. Social media had exploded in popularity, and there were now websites dedicated to reuniting people from all walks of life. Lily suggested they try a new approach, using every online tool available to them. That weekend, the siblings spent hours on Lily's laptop creating profiles on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. They joined groups for Mississippi residents, flood survivors, and volunteer firefighters. Ryan remembered that David had mentioned becoming a volunteer firefighter after their rescue, so they focused their search on fire departments throughout the state. Their breakthrough came 3 weeks later in the most unexpected way. Lily was scrolling through Facebook during her lunch break when she found a group called Mississippi Flood Survivors to 1993. The group had been created by someone organizing a 30th anniversary memorial service for the flood victims. There were only about 50 members, but Lily's heart started racing as she read through the posts. Most of the messages were people sharing memories and photos from that terrible time. But then Lily saw a post that made her hands shake. A woman named Carol Thompson had shared a newspaper clipping from 1993 with the caption, "My husband David was one of the volunteer rescuers that night. He saved 2 children from a car in the floodwaters on Highway 61. We've always wondered what happened to those kids." Lily stared at the post for a full minute, reading it over and over again. The details matched perfectly. Highway 61 was exactly where they had been rescued. 2 children from a car in flood waters. This had to be him. She immediately called Ryan, who was between patients at the hospital. Her voice was shaking so badly that Ryan thought something terrible had happened. "I found him," she whispered into the phone. "Ryan, I think I found David." Within an hour, Ryan had driven from Seattle to Portland, a trip that normally took 3 hours. They sat together in Lily's living room, staring at Carol Thompson's Facebook profile. There were photos of a family, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, 3 grown children, and a man who looked to be in his late 50s with graying hair, and the weathered face of someone who worked with his hands. But it was the eyes that convinced them. Even 30 years later, even in a small profile picture, they recognized something familiar about the man's expression. There was a gentleness there, a warmth that matched their memories of the person who had risked everything to save them. Lily sent Carol Thompson a private message, her fingers trembling as she typed, "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. This might sound strange, but I believe your husband David rescued me and my brother from a flood in Mississippi 30 years ago. We were 7 and 6 years old, and we've been looking for him ever since. Could we possibly speak with you?" The response came back within minutes. "Oh my goodness. Are you the 2 children from the car? David has talked about you both so many times over the years. He's always wondered what happened to you. I'm going to call him right now." 20 minutes later, Lily's phone rang. The area code was from Mississippi. She looked at Ryan, who nodded encouragingly, and answered with a shaking voice. "Hello? Is this Lily?" The voice was deeper than she remembered, weathered by time and cigarettes. But there was something achingly familiar about it. "Yes, Lily." Managed to say, "Is this ... is this David? David Thompson?" There was a long pause, and when the man spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Lily? And Ryan? My God, I can't believe it. I've thought about you 2 every single day for 30 years. Are you okay? Are you both okay?" Ryan moved closer to the phone so he could hear, and when David heard that both children were on the line, he started crying. Not the quiet tears of an adult trying to maintain composure, but the deep, overwhelming sobs of someone who had carried a worry for 3 decades and was finally getting the answer he'd been afraid to hope for. "We're more than okay," Lily said, tears streaming down her own face. "David, we both became exactly what we dreamed of becoming, and it's all because you gave us the chance to grow up. Ryan is a doctor now, and I'm a nurse. We spend our lives helping people because someone once helped us." David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was full of wonder. "You became a doctor and a nurse? Both of you?" He laughed through his tears. "Your parents would have been so proud. I wish they could see you now." They talked for 2 hours that first day, with David asking about their Aunt Grace, their education, their families, and their lives. He told them about becoming a volunteer firefighter, about the other people he'd helped rescue over the years, and about how saving them had changed the entire direction of his life. When they finally hung up, both Lily and Ryan felt like a part of their heart that had been missing for 30 years had finally been returned to them. They immediately started planning a trip to Mississippi, but David had a different idea. He wanted to come to them, he said. He wanted to see the life they'd built, the hospitals where they worked, the people they'd become. The reunion was set. For 2 months later, giving everyone time to process the miracle of finding each other again. But Lily had one more surprise for David. That night, she sat at her kitchen table and carefully folded a new origami crane from gold paper. After 30 years of making them, she was finally going to complete the circle and deliver her promise in person. The morning of May 15, 2023, David Thompson woke up in his hotel room in Portland with butterflies in his stomach like he was a teenager going on his first date. He'd barely slept, partly because of the unfamiliar surroundings, but mostly because he couldn't stop thinking about the fact that in a few hours, he would finally see Lily and Ryan again after 30 long years. David had flown into Portland the night before, his first time on an airplane since his military service in the early 90s. Carol had wanted to come with him, but their youngest daughter was graduating from college that weekend, and someone needed to be there for the family celebration. "You go," Carol had told him, squeezing his hand at the airport. "This is something you need to do by yourself. But take pictures of everything, and don't you dare come home without getting their phone numbers so we can stay in touch." As David got dressed in his best shirt and the new jacket Carol had insisted he buy for the trip, he caught sight of himself in the hotel mirror. At 58, he looked older than he felt, with gray streaks in his hair and lines around his eyes from years of working outdoors. He wondered if Lily and Ryan would even recognize him, or if he'd changed too much from the 28-year-old construction worker who had pulled them from those floodwaters. At exactly 10 o'clock, David walked into the lobby of the DoubleTree Hotel downtown where they had agreed to meet. He was early, as usual, but he'd rather wait than risk being late for the most important reunion of his life. He ordered a coffee and sat in a chair facing the entrance, his heart pounding every time the doors opened. Then he saw them. Lily walked in first, and David recognized her immediately despite the 30 years that had passed. She was tall and graceful, with the same determined expression she'd had as a 7-year-old, but now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. Ryan was right behind her, and while he was taller than David had imagined he'd become, there was still something of that scared little boy in his gentle eyes. For a moment, all three of them just stood there, staring at each other across the hotel lobby. Then Lily's face broke into a smile that was exactly the same as the one she'd given him that terrible night when he'd promised to come back for her. And David felt 30 years of wondering and worrying melt away in an instant. The hug that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. David found himself crying again, something he'd been doing a lot more of since their phone call 2 months earlier. Lily and Ryan were both taller than him now, but somehow he still felt like he was holding those 2 frightened children he'd carried to safety all those years ago. "You look exactly the same," Lily said, laughing through her tears. "Older, but exactly the same." "You two don't look anything like I expected," David replied, shaking his head in amazement. "You're all grown up. You're doctors and nurses and parents." "I can't believe it." They spent the morning in the hotel restaurant, talking and sharing photos and stories. David learned that Lily had 2 daughters of her own, ages 8 and 10, and that Ryan had recently gotten married to a pediatric surgeon he'd met during his residency. Both of them spoke about Great Aunt Grace with tremendous love and gratitude, and David could see that despite all their tragedy, they had been raised by someone who truly cared about them. But what struck David most was how they talked about their work. Both Lily and Ryan described their medical careers not as jobs, but as callings. They told him about the children they'd helped, the families they'd comforted during crisis, and the way they approached each emergency with the knowledge that someone's entire world might depend on what happened in the next few minutes. "You know," Ryan said at one point, "I became a doctor because of you. Not just because you saved my life, but because you showed me what it looks like when someone refuses to walk away from people who need help." David was quiet for a long moment. stirring his coffee and trying to process what he was hearing. "I just did what anyone would do," he said finally, the same words he'd been saying for 30 years. "No," Lily said firmly. "That's not true, and we need you to understand that. We've spent our entire adult lives working in emergency medicine, and we've seen how people react in crisis situations. Most people freeze. Most people call for help and wait for someone else to handle it. You didn't do what anyone would do. You did what a hero does." After lunch, Lily and Ryan asked if David would like to see where they worked. They drove him first to Portland Children's Hospital, where Lily walked him through the pediatric ward she supervised. David met the nurses and doctors who worked under Lily's direction, and he could see immediately why she was respected. She was calm, competent, and had a way of talking to scared children that reminded him of how she'd comforted her little brother that night in the flood. Then they went to Ryan's hospital, where David got to see the emergency room where Ryan worked as an attending physician. It was a busy place, with ambulances coming and going and medical staff moving with a kind of urgent precision that David recognized from his own years as a volunteer firefighter. Ryan introduced David to his colleagues as the man who saved my life, and David was embarrassed by the way everyone looked at him like he was some kind of celebrity dot, but the real surprise came that evening, when Lily and Ryan drove David to a community center across town for what they said was a small dinner with a few friends. David was expecting maybe a dozen people, but when they walked into the building, he found himself facing a room full of nearly 200 people, all applauding. The banner hanging across the front of the room read, "Welcome home, David Thompson." And as David looked around in confusion, he realized that many of the faces in the crowd were familiar. There were doctors and nurses from both hospitals, but there were also people he didn't recognize, families with children, elderly couples, and young adults who seemed to know exactly who he was. Ryan took the microphone and explained to David and the crowd that the event wasn't just a reunion dinner. Over the past 2 months, since finding David, Lily and Ryan had been working on something they'd been planning for years. They had established a foundation dedicated to training community members in emergency water rescue techniques, and they had used their savings and fundraising efforts to create a scholarship program for young people who wanted to pursue careers in emergency services. "For 30 years, Lily said when she took the microphone, my brother and I have been trying to figure out how to repay a debt that can never really be repaid. You gave us our lives, David, and everything we've accomplished since that night exists because you refused to let us die." The foundation, they explained, would be headquartered in Mississippi near David's hometown. They had already purchased land for a training facility that would include controlled flood simulation pools for rescue training, and they had endowed a scholarship fund worth $500,000 for students from low-income families who wanted to become firefighters, paramedics, or emergency medical technicians. But the most meaningful part of the announcement came when Ryan revealed that the training center would be called the Thompson Family Emergency Training Institute, honoring not just David, but his wife Carol and their children who had supported his volunteer work for all these years. David was speechless. He sat in his chair, staring at the architectural drawings and financial documents that Lily and Ryan had prepared, trying to understand that 2 children he'd pulled from floodwater 30 years ago had grown up to create something that would save countless other lives. "This is too much," he finally managed to say. "I don't deserve this." "Yes, you do," said a voice from the back of the room. David turned to see an elderly man walking toward him with the help of a walker. "My name is Robert Chun," the man said. "Grace was my sister. She passed away last year, but before she died, she made me promise to tell you something if we ever found you." The room went completely quiet as Robert Chun reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Grace wrote this letter 5 years ago," he said, handing it to David. She wanted you to know that Lily and Ryan weren't the only ones whose lives you saved that night. You saved our whole family by making sure those children survived to carry on their parents' memory." As David read Grace's letter, with its elegant handwriting and words of gratitude that spanned 30 years, he finally understood that the rescue had never really been about just one night. It had been about creating a future where love and courage could continue to grow and spread, touching lives that David would never even know about. The evening ended with Lily presenting David with a golden origami crane she had made, completing the promise she'd made as a 7-year-old girl. But this time, instead of being a symbol of hope for an uncertain future, it was a symbol of gratitude for a life well lived and a legacy that would continue for generations. As David flew home to Mississippi the next morning, he carried with him not just photos and memories of an incredible reunion, but the knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can do in life is simply refuse to walk away when someone needs help. The ripples from that choice would continue spreading long after he was gone, saving lives and creating heroes he would never meet.